Imagine standing in the Iraqi desert, the sun beating down mercilessly, staring at a mound of earth that doesn't quite look natural. Beneath your feet lies something extraordinary, something that would force historians to completely rewrite the story of human civilization. Because buried here, under thousands of years of sand and silence, is evidence of something that shouldn't exist. Not yet. Not this early in human history. The year is 1849, and British archaeologist William Loftus has just made a discovery that will haunt scholars for the next century and a half. He's found walls, massive walls. And behind those walls, the remains of what appears to be a fully functioning city, complete with specialized workers, written records, sophisticated architecture, and organized government. The problem? This city is older than it has any right to be. So old, in fact, that it predates the pyramids of Egypt by more than 1,500 years. What Loftus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he'd just uncovered the world's first city, a place where humanity took its first uncertain steps away from caves and campfires toward something entirely new, something that would change our species forever. But here's where the mystery deepens. Why did this happen here? Why did people suddenly decide to abandon a way of life that had worked perfectly well for hundreds of thousands of years? And perhaps most intriguingly, what happened to these first city dwellers that caused their revolutionary experiment to end in catastrophic collapse? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The place we're talking about is called Uruk. If that name doesn't ring a bell, don't feel bad. Despite being arguably the most important city in human history, it's been largely forgotten by everyone except archaeologists and ancient history specialists. But around 5,000 years ago, Uruk wasn't just important. It was the center of the known world. Located in what's now southern Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Uruk rose from the marshlands of ancient Mesopotamia during a period archaeologists call the Uruk period, roughly 4,000 to 3,100 BCE. To put that in perspective, when Uruk was at its height, Stonehenge hadn't been built yet. The oldest Egyptian dynasties were still centuries away. Most of humanity still lived in small villages, hunting and farming, much as their ancestors had done for millennia. But something different was happening in Mesopotamia, something unprecedented. The region itself was a paradox, potentially incredibly fertile, but naturally quite hostile. The rivers flooded unpredictably. The summers were brutally hot. There was almost no stone for building, no timber for construction, and no metal for tools. Everything had to be improvised or imported. It wasn't obvious prime real estate for humanity's greatest experiment in communal living. Yet it was precisely these challenges that may have sparked the revolution. Because when you can't rely on nature to cooperate, you need organization, you need planning, you need lots of people working together toward common goals. You need, in other words, a city. At its peak, Uruk covered nearly 2.5 square miles and housed somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. To our modern ears, that might not sound impressive. But remember, this was a world where most humans still lived in groups of a few dozen or a few hundred at most. Uruk represented a concentration of humanity unlike anything that had ever existed. Walking through Uruk's gates around 3200 BCE, you would have encountered something that would feel strangely familiar to us today, yet would have seemed like absolute sorcery to people living just a few generations earlier. The city was dominated by massive temple complexes, the largest dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, war, and political power. These weren't simple shrines. They were architectural marvels, built with millions of mud bricks, decorated with elaborate mosaics, and served by hundreds of priests and temple workers. But the temples were just the beginning. Uruk had specialized craftsmen, potters, weavers, metalworkers, jewelers, each focused on their particular trade. This specialization was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, you could be born into a world where you didn't have to know how to hunt or farm to survive. You could spend your entire life perfecting a single craft, trading your goods for everything else you needed. The city had administrators keeping track of goods. It had laborers building walls and digging canals. It had merchants trading with distant lands, bringing in the timber, stone, and metals that Mesopotamia lacked. Archaeological evidence shows that Uruk's trade networks extended hundreds of miles in every direction, to the mountains of Iran, the cedars of Lebanon, even as far as Afghanistan, for precious lapis lazuli. This is where things get truly fascinating. Because to manage all this complexity, thousands of workers, massive building projects, trade with distant lands, redistribution of grain and goods, Uruk's administrators faced a problem that had never existed before. Human memory simply wasn't enough anymore. You couldn't keep track of thousands of transactions in your head, so they invented something that seems almost mundane to us, but was absolutely revolutionary at the time. They invented writing. The earliest writing from Uruk wasn't poetry or mythology or royal propaganda. It was accounting. Simple clay tablets marked with pictographs representing goods, so many jars of oil, so many bushels of grain, so many head of cattle. The script we call cuneiform began as nothing more than glorified inventory lists. But think about what that represents. For the first time in the entire history of life on Earth, information could be preserved outside a living brain. Ideas could outlive the people who thought them. Knowledge could accumulate across generations in ways that had never been possible before. Writing wasn't the only innovation. Uruk's administrators also developed mathematics, creating a sophisticated number system based on the number 60, a system so useful that we still divide our hours into 60 minutes and our circles into 360 degrees. They created the world's earliest known cylinder seals, carved stones that could be rolled across wet clay to leave an impression proving ownership or authority. They developed the potter's wheel, mass-producing ceramics with an efficiency that village potters couldn't match. They organized labor on scales that allowed them to dig canals, build walls, and construct monuments that required thousands of workers moving millions of bricks. In other words, Uruk invented bureaucracy, and while that might not sound romantic, it was absolutely essential. Cities simply can't function without it. But here's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night. Why did people accept this? Think about what city life demanded. If you were a farmer living in a small village around 3500 BCE, you were poor by modern standards, but you were largely free. You worked hard, but you worked for yourself and your family. You answered to no one except perhaps a village elder or headman. Then along comes the city, asking you to give up that independence, to work on building projects you didn't choose, to hand over a portion of your harvest to temple administrators, to accept your place in a rigid hierarchy where priests and officials made decisions that affected your life, to follow rules you had no say in creating. Why would anyone agree to that? The answer seems to be that cities offered something villages couldn't: security and opportunity on a scale that made the trade-off worthwhile. Uruk's massive walls protected you from raiders. Its granaries stored surplus that could feed you during famines. Its temples provided not just spiritual comfort, but also economic stability, redistributing goods and organizing labor. And perhaps most importantly, the city offered possibilities. Your children might become skilled craftsmen. Your family might prosper through trade. You might participate in something larger and more permanent than any village could offer. There was likely a religious dimension too. The temples weren't just administrative centers. They were believed to be the literal houses of the gods. To live near the temple of Inanna, to contribute to its upkeep, to participate in its festivals, was to live in the presence of divine power. For people who genuinely believed the gods controlled every aspect of life, the floods, the harvests, victory in war, That proximity mattered enormously. But now we arrive at the midpoint revelation, the discovery that changed everything archaeologists thought they knew about Uruk's development. For decades, scholars assumed that cities developed gradually. First villages, then towns, then small cities, then larger ones. A slow, steady progression over many centuries. But when archaeologists began using modern dating techniques and conducting more systematic excavations at Uruk in the late 20th century, they discovered something shocking. Uruk didn't grow slowly. It exploded. The evidence shows that Uruk went from being a modest town to a massive city in perhaps just 2 or 3 generations. The surrounding countryside was essentially depopulated as people flooded into the city at a rate that has few parallels in history. Something dramatic had happened, something that made rural life suddenly unviable or city life suddenly irresistible on a massive scale. What could cause such a rapid transformation? Archaeologists have proposed several theories, and the truth likely involves a combination of factors. Climate data suggests that this period saw significant environmental changes in Mesopotamia. The rivers may have shifted course. Rainfall patterns may have changed. Perhaps independent farming became much harder, forcing people to rely on the organized irrigation systems that only cities could maintain. There's also evidence of conflict. Uruk's walls weren't decorative. They were defensive, massive, and imposing. Other settlements in the region show signs of abandonment or destruction during this period. It's possible that warfare or raiding made scattered villages too dangerous, driving people to seek safety in numbers. Some archaeologists propose a more economic explanation. Perhaps Uruk's early success at organizing labor and trade created a kind of economic gravity, pulling in people from surrounding areas who wanted access to goods, markets, and opportunities they couldn't find elsewhere. Success bred more success, until Uruk became too important to ignore. But there's another theory that's gained traction in recent years, one that's simultaneously more mundane and more profound. Perhaps people came to Uruk simply because other people were there. Think about it from a psychological perspective. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived in small groups where everyone knew everyone else. Your world was perhaps 100 or 200 people, maximum. Then suddenly, there's a place where thousands of people gather, where you can hear dozens of languages, see goods from distant lands, witness massive building projects, participate in spectacular religious festivals, where every day brings something new and unexpected. Maybe people came to Uruk for the same reason people have always moved to cities, because cities are exciting, because they offer variety and novelty and possibility in ways that village life simply can't match. The world's first city may have succeeded for the same reason cities still succeed today, because humans, for all our talk about loving nature and peace and quiet, are actually drawn to the energy and chaos and opportunity that only dense concentrations of humanity can provide. Life in Uruk wasn't easy, of course. Sanitation was primitive by modern standards. Diseases would have spread quickly in such crowded conditions. The social stratification was extreme. Temple elites lived in luxury, while laborers lived in cramped quarters. Archaeological evidence shows signs of malnutrition among lower-class residents, suggesting that the benefits of city life weren't equally distributed. But Uruk persisted. For nearly 1,000 years, it remained one of the most important cities in Mesopotamia. Its innovations spread: writing, bureaucracy, specialized labor, monumental architecture, copied by other cities throughout the region. The Sumerian civilization that Uruk helped birth would eventually give rise to the Akkadian Empire, then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians. The template Uruk created, dense urban centers serving as political, economic, and religious hubs, would become the model for civilizations around the world. The city features prominently in some of humanity's oldest literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest known works of written storytelling, is set in Uruk. Its hero, Gilgamesh, was likely based on a real king who ruled the city around 2700 BCE. The epic describes Uruk's walls with awe, calling them a marvel that will endure forever. It's a testament to how deeply the people of ancient Mesopotamia revered this first great experiment in urban living. But nothing lasts forever. By the time of the Roman Empire, Uruk was in decline. The rivers that had given it life had shifted course. Trade routes had moved. Newer cities had eclipsed it. The last cuneiform tablet from Uruk dates to around 100 CE, roughly 5,000 years after the city's founding. After that, silence. The city was abandoned, gradually buried by sand and time, forgotten by everyone except local Bedouin, who called the ruins Warka and told stories about the giants who must have built such massive walls. When William Loftus began excavating in 1849, he had no idea what he'd found. The connection between these ruins and the Uruk mentioned in ancient texts wouldn't be confirmed for decades. The full significance that this was where cities began, where writing began, where so many of the technologies and organizational systems that define civilization began, took even longer to understand. Even today, much of Uruk remains unexcavated. War and instability in Iraq have made archaeological work difficult and dangerous. Looting has damaged irreplaceable artifacts. Climate change threatens to erode what remains. The world's first city is in danger of being lost before we fully understand it. What we have learned, though, is profound. Uruk teaches us that the shift from village to city wasn't just a change in where people lived. It was a fundamental transformation in what it meant to be human. For the first time, people existed in social structures too large for everyone to know everyone else. For the first time, your survival depended on cooperating with strangers. For the first time, specialized knowledge became more valuable than general survival skills. For the first time, your identity was defined not just by your family or clan, but by your role in a complex social machine. These changes brought enormous benefits: surplus food, technological innovation, art, literature, architecture, systems of law. But they also brought new forms of inequality, new vulnerabilities to disease and warfare, new anxieties about social status and economic security. The archaeological record from Uruk shows both the triumphs and the costs of civilization. Here's what might be most remarkable: the fundamental bargain that Uruk's residents accepted, surrendering some personal freedom in exchange for security, opportunity, and participation in something larger than themselves, is the same bargain people in cities make today. The challenges Uruk faced: how to organize large numbers of people, how to distribute resources fairly, how to balance individual needs against collective welfare, how to maintain order without crushing creativity. These are still the central challenges of urban life 5,000 years later. Uruk's story is ultimately our story. It's where we became who we are, not just hunter-gatherers or farmers, but city dwellers, living in artificial landscapes of our own creation, sustained by elaborate networks of specialization and trade, connected to thousands or millions of people we'll never personally know, our fates tied to abstract systems like bureaucracy and economy and government. Standing in the ruins of Uruk today, or looking at photographs of those ruins, since few of us will ever visit, it's hard not to feel a sense of connection across the millennia. Those ancient Mesopotamians who first gathered in this place, who first decided to try living in groups of thousands rather than dozens, who first created writing to track their transactions and temples to house their gods, they were trying to solve the same fundamental problem humans still grapple with. How do we live together? How do we create communities larger and more complex than our evolutionary heritage prepared us for? How do we build something that lasts? They didn't have all the answers. Uruk eventually fell, but for 1,000 years it stood as proof that the experiment could work, that humans could create something unprecedented, that we could imagine a new way of living and bring it into being through cooperation and innovation. Every city on Earth, New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, is an echo of Uruk. Every government bureaucracy, every written law, every specialized profession, every trade network is following a path that first civilization blazed 5,000 years ago in the Mesopotamian marshlands. The world's first city didn't just build walls and temples, it built a template for human civilization that we're still using today. And that's worth remembering, especially in our own era of rapid urban growth and technological change. The challenges we face aren't entirely new. The anxieties we feel about losing our connection to nature, about inequality, about living among strangers, about the pace of change, people in Uruk likely felt versions of the same things. They faced those challenges and built something extraordinary, something that changed our species forever, something that, 5,000 years later, we're still trying to fully understand. That's the real legacy of Uruk, not just that it was first, but that it dared to imagine something that had never existed and then made it real. In doing so, it showed that humans are capable of transforming not just our environment, but ourselves. The world's first city was also, in many ways, the birthplace of who we are today.